Hello everybody, this is Grandmaster Georg Meyer and I'm happy to do my first video for chess.com, and I'm lucky to be able to do a series on one of my favorite subjects, and that's the Catalan opening from White's point of view. So the main position or the starting position of the Catalan we get after these four moves. And why should anyone play the Catalan? Maybe the first question to answer. And the thing is that sometime in the 1920s, it was like a weird new idea to put the bishop on g2 instead of just playing knight c3 and bishop g5 and the normal queen's gambit. But it turned out that it's a way to develop your pieces that is really hard to meet, because the white bishop is going to go to g2 and exert a lot of pressure on this long diagonal. And basically, this gives black two general options on how to face this opening. It is either to take on c4, which is what we are going to look at today, or to play a more modest development with bishop e7 and just castle and be a little bit passive. And over the years, it has turned out that there is no way for black to really equalize. White is always having some kind of nagging edge, and this is also why we see the Catalan become so popular even on the highest level, and it doesn't stop. There is one top player who's maybe the most famous Catalan player, that is Vladimir Kramnik. And throughout most of his career, he managed to put real pressure on with the white pieces using the Catalan time and again. So what we're going to look at today, black taking on c4 and then trying to hang on to this pawn. Because of course the critical test of every pawn sacrifice is when it's accepted and one just tries to keep the material, complete development and be a healthy pawn up. So for now white isn't bothered, we go bishop g2. And now black reveals his intentions playing b5. Firmly defending his pawn on c4, but clearly there is a big danger in exposing this long diagonal. So to use that black is not yet developed and that this pawn chain b5 c4 is kind of weak, white goes a4. And now it's actually not so easy to defend these two pawns. The only move at black's disposal turns out to be c6. a6 simply isn't possible on account of ab, and the rook on a8 is hanging, so black cannot take back. And playing b4 is like a strategical mistake, because if the knight d5, white is just in time to take the pawn back. So c6. And still the long diagonal is weak, and white can pounce on this fact playing knight e5, which is like such a natural move for white, opening up his bishop on g2 and putting pressure on c6, which is for now keeping this long diagonal closed. So go to bed, black has to go knight d5, which is really not what you want to do in the opening, move another piece again instead of continuing your development, but this is what black has to do if he wants to try to hang on to this pawn. So now is just a good moment to continue development, and what I really like about the Catalan is that we don't really worry so much about giving up this pawn, but we just want to develop our pieces and then from a position of strength with superior development just basically crush the opponent. And we're going to see how this works out nicely in this line. So castles, bishop b7, trying to get some grip on the long diagonal, and now e4. And we see that having blocked the long diagonal with knight d5, basically black had to make a concession of losing more time since it invited e4 with gain of tempo. But this is a very important strategical moment, because although black has invited white to play e4 for free, the long diagonal is kind of closed, and the bishop on g2 is now blunted by this pawn on e4. So black would be very happy to just carry on with his development, play bishop e7, castle, and then he can soon just pretend that he's a pawn up for nothing. So what do we do when we have a lead in development? And the question is the same if it's the king's gambit, the queen's gambit, or the Catalan. We try to open up the position. So what would be a logical way here to open up the position? Which moves come to mind? One good move, of course, would be to go d5. And it turns out that after bishop e7, ab, cb, knight c3 with tempo attacking b5, a6, white needs to further open up the position and play b3, and white has a nice initiative. But if you go back to the position where we played d5, it turns out that there's an even stronger idea, which in my opinion is the refutation of the whole system that started with b5. And instead of d5, this is to play b3. So, of course, black has to take on b3, otherwise white is going to recuperate the pawn with a great position. So c takes b3. And now we want to open up the position to the maximum. So AB, CB, and queen b3 comes with tempo now. b5 has to be protected, so black goes a6. And now, of course, what is the next step in opening up the position further? Now is the time for d5. And if we count material at this point, of course white is a pawn down, but let's look at the developed pieces. First of all, white's king is of course safe already, so the rook on f1 is about to join the game, the queen on b3 is already active, the knight on e5 of course, the bishop on g2, and what does black have? A knight on f6 and a bishop on b7, and he's facing the immediate prospect of his kingside being ripped open by d5 takes e6. So if we count material in that way, maybe white is for now like 2 pieces up. But this means also that we have to act decisively and get something out of this superior development. So let's look first at e takes d5, which of course is answered by e d5, opening up the e-file. And the rook will be soon able to annoy the black king from e1. But just going further, bishop takes d5. Now of course it would be wrong to take on d5 because of the queen d5. Black gets a queen out, threatening more exchanges. And as the e-file has just been opened, we should use this with tempo and play queen e3. And now it's actually very difficult for black to find a defensive move at all, because bishop e7, which is natural, is just met by rook d1. And there is just too much pressure already, and black is going to lose a piece on d5. So instead, black has to go queen e7, but such an artificial move just cannot be any good. We continue attacking with tempo, bishop a3, queen e6, and another heavy piece onto the e-file. And here white is eventually going to pick up some serious material, because sooner or later the queen is going to be removed from e3 and threaten even just a modest knight d3 or any other knight move, picking up a lot of material on the e-file. So it turns out that e d5 is kind of suicidal, and instead black has to find ways to further his development. There's been a very high-level game between Anish Giri and Alexander Morozevich, which featured bishop d6. And as I said, white needs to act really decisively before black gets to complete his development, and he just went for knight f7. King f7, d takes e6, king e8. Now of course the king is a cause of concern for the rest of the game. It cannot castle anymore and is seriously restricted by the white pawn on e6. And we throw more fuel into the fire with e5, bishop takes g2. And one thing that is really important in the attack is not to slow down too early. Of course, sometimes there is just a moment to pick up material to decide the game, but when we are attacking, we should look for attacking moves and not just take back with the king on g2 or something like that. So e takes f6 is very strong, just threatening, for example, after bishop f1, e7, and next, for example, queen c8, fg7, and that's going to be a new queen. So black has to eliminate this pawn on f6. And now we can take back on g2 and invite black basically to lose more time taking on a1, because he cannot play on with equal material and the king on e8. That is just strategical resignation. So queen a1. And now Giri missed a very nice way to decide the game. He played bishop b2, and after queen a4, black could try to disturb the white coordination. But if he had found the stronger knight c3, black has no way to remove the white queen from the very powerful square on b3, where it's ready to jump onto d5 and attack a whole lot of black pieces. And also, more importantly, we are simply getting the knight into the game. It's ready to go to e4, and then bishop b2, and we see the black position crumble immediately. And let's just look at one line of the knight c3, bishop e5, knight d5, now threatening bishop a3, so the queen has to get out, bishop a3 anyways. And after a series of moves, we can see the very harmonious way to finish the game, rook c1, getting the last piece into play with the decisive threat of mate in 1. And here there's nothing black can do, since he's basically just playing with his queen and a lone bishop on e5 against 4 active white pieces with a very strong pawn on e6. So it should never surprise you at all that white is just completely winning, since he's playing with like 3 pieces up. So let's get back to the moment where black went bishop d6. And let's look at another sensible move, queen b6. The idea is simply to protect on e6 with the queen, so that d6 can be met with queen e6, trying to exchange pieces. And without the e6, it seems like it's not easy for white to make direct progress. And now comes an amazing idea for white to disturb black's coordination, which is why I chose the game that we are following until now. It's an old game from some Soviet masters in the 80s. And here white went knight c4. The point being, of course, that the queen on b6 is not protected, so b takes c4 is impossible. And after queen c7 in the game, white was rerouting the knight to a5, putting huge pressure on the long diagonal again, because if the bishop on b7 disappears, then the bishop on g2 is going to become a monster, and white just needs to clear the long diagonal of his pawns to decide the game. So much more testing than queen c7 would have been queen d4. And as I said before, when we are attacking, and so much more active and well developed with our pieces, we should not slow down unless we really have to. And the way to continue development and putting pressure on black is to go knight a3. So queen a1 is not really an option, because after bishop b2 we recuperate the queen and all the pieces are ready for the attack. So black takes on a3. Now this is a serious concession, because we'll get a very strong dark squared bishop. And now white is playing knight a3 and getting ready to butter the black queen with bishop b2. So in case of queen a1, bishop b2, black has to give up the queen, king f1. And now again all white's pieces are in the game, threatening to open up the position with either knight takes b5 or d takes e6. And if black goes e d5, then the black pawn structure on the king's head is going to be shattered forever. And this position is kind of strategically winning, because of the knight d7, queen e3. The black king cannot castle. And the white knight is about to look at all the weak squares in black's position. And eventually black will just not be able to defend his king anymore. So of course, instead of knight d7, castles would come to mind. But then knight c4 almost puts an end to black's resistance, because taking is impossible, losing too much material. And if the knight is allowed to go to d6, then it's just gonna get very close to the black king eventually, with f5 in sight and the white queen quickly swinging over to give mate. While a lot has happened in, for example, the last line we've looked at, it's kind of natural that all the time we have to transform our advantage. So when we exchange something, of course, like on f6, we want to get something serious in return, like shattering the black king's pawn shield in front of him, and then there will be no defense in the long run. But otherwise, we just try to attack with all the energy we have and not to go backwards or make exchanges. It's quite instructive what happened in the game after knight c4, and not queen d4, but queen c7. White went knight a5, and now facing the threat of knight b7 and subsequent opening of the long diagonal, black decided to close the position. And of course, closing the position sounds good when you're still a pawn up and trying to finish development. But now let's do again some creative counting of material. Of course, black is his pawn up, but what about the rest of the pieces? We see that black has developed the bishop on b7 and the knight on f6. And what they are doing, they're basically biting on granite in the form of the white pawn chain on e4 and d5. So these pieces are not doing anything at all. And the black queen is standing on c7 on an open file where the rook's below. So it's going to get kicked around pretty soon by a white rook appearing on c1. And after my last comment, the next white move is really natural, just continuing development and getting ready to occupy the c file. So black, of course, has to continue development too. Now white on rook c1. And white is about to fully complete his development and then again have a situation where he's basically playing with a couple more pieces in the game. And as we see, the white pawn on d5 does a really great job in restricting the whole black position. So black goes queen e7. And now the most natural move for white would, of course, be knight d2, just continuing development. And there would already be threats like knight d2 to c4, with usual ideas we have of taking on b7. And again, white played a little more artificially. f3, just protecting the pawn on e4 with the idea to go bishop h3. and not allowing this bishop on b7 to ever get back into the game again. This is why black played queen d7, and here actually white could have played bishop h3 anyways, because queen h3 would be met by knight b7, and now actually black cannot really defend, since queen d7 is met by take and rook c8, picking up a whole rook. And in all these lines it looks like black is kind of helpless, and this is because he's playing with much less pieces in the game. So instead, white went for a more academic approach in the game, played bishop c5. He just wanted to exchange the bishop on d6 because it's controlling the entry square on the c5. And in the game this worked out nicely too, because of the bishop c5, rook c5, bishop c8, white went queen c3, and after castling, rook c7. And getting onto the 7th rank, he had established a complete bind on the black position. But when you make somewhat artificial moves, there can always be some counter chances for black, and actually here there was a really tricky way to make things complicated. Black could play queen b6, freeing d7 for the b8 knight, and the main point being that knight b7 would be met by queen b6, attacking the knight on b7 and the rook that cannot move because of the pin on the king on g1. But in the game queen d8 wasn't found, and after bishop c8, queen c3 castles, black was soon completely out of moves and basically had to reduce himself to being a spectator on how nicely white can put his pieces. They made a few more moves, and eventually black just decided this is enough and resigned. So what have we learned about the Catalan in this very first video? First of all, if black takes the pawn and wants to keep it, he's running real big danger of not getting into the game at all, because black had to make a couple of moves that were not furthering his development. Let's go back and see again. He went c6, he went knight d5, a few moves later the knight got kicked, and then white punished all of this, opening up the position, starting with b3 and later with d5. And then the superior development was very clearly felt. And as a general note to finish this first video, the ambitious lines for black usually carry a lot of risks, and if white knows what he's doing and plays forcefully, they can lead to quite drastic defeats. On the other hand, if black plays in a more classical, solid fashion, in a lot of the main Catalan lines he has a relatively passive position for most of the game and is defending. This dilemma is actually why the Catalan is so popular also when the white player is very happy to just play for 2 results.